He stood in my kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, and he said it like it was nothing. Like I was nothing. Mom, honestly, you're more of a liability than an asset at this point. I was 67 years old. I had just made him a pot of coffee. I didn't say anything. I turned back to the counter and I poured myself a cup and I looked out the window at the oak tree in the backyard, the one my husband Gerald planted the year our son was born. It was still there. It was still standing. I kept thinking about that. Let me back up a little, because this didn't start in my kitchen. It started the way most things do, slowly and with love, or what I thought was love. I retired in the spring of 2019. 31 years as a middle school librarian in Dayton, Ohio. I know people don't think of that as a grand career, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. I knew every kid in that building by name. I knew which ones needed a quiet place more than they needed a book. I knew the ones whose parents weren't around, the ones who came in just to sit somewhere warm. When Gerald died, that was 2017. Pancreatic cancer, 7 months from diagnosis to the end, I threw myself back into work. That library was the only place I didn't feel like a ghost. But when I retired, the quiet got very loud. My son. I'll call him my son because that's what he is. That's what I raised him to be. He called me about 3 weeks after my last day. Mom, why are you rattling around in that house alone? It's too big for you. It's not safe. He wasn't wrong about the size. It was a 4-bedroom colonial in Kettering, the house where he grew up, where his sister Nadine and I still had Sunday dinners before she moved to Portland. It was too big. The upstairs felt like a different country. Come stay with us for a while, he said. Just try it. Nina would love to have you close. Nina is his wife. They'd been married 11 years at that point. They had 2 kids, my grandchildren, who I would have walked through fire for. The older one, a boy, was 8. The little one, a girl, just turned 5. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 2 months. I drove past their house on a Saturday afternoon when I knew they'd be home, and I sat in the car for a long time, watching my granddaughter push a plastic lawnmower across the yard. She was talking to it, giving it instructions. I called my son from the driveway. I said yes. The plan was straightforward. I would sell my house in Kettering, which I did in October of 2019 for $287,000 after 30 years of mortgage payments. That money was mine. Savings I'd built on a librarian's salary, careful and slow. I also had my pension, just over $1,900 a month, and a small IRA I'd never touched. The arrangement we agreed on, I would contribute at $200 a month toward household expenses. I would help with the kids, pickups and drop-offs, sick days when Nina had to work. I would have the guest suite on the main floor, which had its own bathroom and a separate entrance from the side yard. It seemed fair. It seemed like family. I moved in on a Saturday in November. My son carried boxes. The kids made me a welcome sign out of construction paper and tape. My granddaughter drew a picture of what she said was me and her holding hands, though we both had the same number of fingers, which was 6. I put it on my nightstand. For the first few months, it was good. Not perfect, but good. Nina was cordial in a careful sort of way. She never said anything unkind, but she also wasn't warm. She had a way of making decisions about the house and then informing me afterward. New rules about which cabinet held what. A schedule for the shared laundry, a request, delivered as a suggestion, that I not come into the main part of the house after 9 in the evening. I adjusted. I told myself this was her home. I had invited myself into it. My son was busy. He worked in logistics, long hours, a lot of time on calls. When he was home, he was tired, and when he was tired, he defaulted to agreeing with whatever Nina had last said. I told myself that was normal too. What started to change, and I've thought about when exactly, and I think it was March of 2020, when the world shut down and suddenly we were all home together every day, was the tone. Nothing dramatic at first. Small things. Nina making a comment about the grocery store receipt. You bought the expensive olive oil again, as though I hadn't handed her $1,200 that morning and helped with the kids every day that week. My son saying over dinner, that maybe I should think about switching my checking to their bank so that transfers would be easier. I said I'd think about it, and I did think about it, and I didn't do it. That was the first thing I held on to without explaining why. By fall of 2020, the $1,200 had become $1,500, not a conversation, just a new number Nina mentioned one evening. Something about property taxes going up. I didn't argue. I told myself I was being helpful. By the following spring, the kids' after-school activities had expanded to include my driving them to swim practice 3 afternoons a week and Saturday soccer. And somehow the understanding became that I would also cover my own groceries separately, and that the household contribution would go up again to $1,800 because they'd had to switch the kids to a new pediatrician who was out of network. I want to be clear. I loved being with those children. I loved watching my grandson read his first chapter book. I loved teaching my granddaughter to make biscuits on Sunday mornings, her hands white with flour, delighted with herself. Those parts were real and I don't regret them. But by the end of that year, I had contributed, I went back and added it up, over $26,000 to their household, not counting my labor, not counting the gas, not counting the birthday parties and Christmas presents I bought the kids from my own pocket while Nina's parents visited with envelopes of cash and called it fair. And my name was not on anything in that house. Not the mortgage, not the utilities. I was a paying guest who also happened to raise 2 children 5 days a week. I still didn't say anything. I had gotten very good at being quiet. The summer my granddaughter turned 7, Nina's mother came to stay for 2 weeks. She had opinions about the house, and she shared them freely. One evening I overheard her in the kitchen with Nina. I wasn't trying to listen. I was getting a glass of water. She should be paying more, Nina's mother said. What does she spend her pension on? She lives here for free. It's not free, Nina said, but not the way I'd hoped she would say it. More like she was correcting a technicality. Does she have savings? Some. Then she should be contributing them. I stood in the hallway with my glass of water for a long moment. Then I went back to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed and I looked at the picture my granddaughter had drawn of us on my nightstand and I thought, I need to make a phone call. Not yet, but soon. The conversation with my son happened on a Tuesday morning, a week after Nina's mother left. He came into the kitchen while I was making coffee, and I could tell before he spoke that he'd been rehearsed. He told me they needed to talk about the finances. He said the house had gotten expensive. He said Nina felt like the current arrangement wasn't sustainable. He said they were thinking it made more sense for me to start drawing down my IRA to help cover a larger share. I asked him what share he had in mind. He said they'd been thinking around $3,000 a month, plus continuing to manage the kids' schedules. I looked at him for a moment. This boy I had driven to every baseball practice and sat up with through every fever and sent to college because Gerald and I had saved for 18 years to make sure he could go without debt. I said I needed to think about it. He looked relieved, like the hard part was over. It wasn't. I made my phone call that afternoon. Her name was Ingrid. I'd known her since before my son was born. We'd met at a neighborhood association meeting in 1987, and we'd stayed close the way you stay close with someone who has seen all your decades. She lived about 40 minutes away, in a house she owned outright, a small brick ranch with a garden she tended like a second career. I asked if the offer she'd made twice before was still open. She said yes without asking why. The other call I made was to a woman named Loretta Marsh, a financial advisor I had seen once before Gerald died and then neglected to go back to. I explained the situation. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you have full access to all your own accounts?" I said I did. She said, "Keep it that way." We talked for an hour. She laid out what I had and what I needed and what I should do, in what order. She was steady and clear, and she didn't tell me what to feel, which was exactly what I needed. I spent the next 6 weeks doing what she told me, slowly, one step at a time, without rushing, without drawing attention. I was a librarian. I knew how to be thorough and quiet. The IRA stayed where it was. What I moved was a portion of my house sale proceeds, money that had been sitting in a high-yield savings account, which I'd never mentioned to my son or Nina because they had never asked directly, and I had never volunteered it. I transferred it into a new account at a credit union across town, in my name only. I reviewed my will, which was outdated, and I met with an estate attorney to update it. I set up automatic transfers of my pension into the new account. I said yes to Ingrid. I told no one. In September of that year, on a Thursday evening, my son came into my room while I was reading. He knocked, which he'd started doing in the last few weeks. I had noticed the change in him, a slight carefulness, like he sensed something had shifted even if he didn't know what. He sat down in the chair by the window, and he said they'd talked more about the finances, and they felt that the $3,000 arrangement needed to start in October. I put down my book. I told him I had something to say, and I needed him to hear me all the way through before he responded. He nodded. I told him I had added up what I had contributed in the 3 years I had lived in his house, and that the number, conservatively, was over $78,000, including cash contributions and unpaid child care at current market rates in our county. I told him I was grateful for the time with the grandchildren, and that I meant that. I told him that I had spoken with a financial advisor and that I had determined, clearly, that the arrangement as he was proposing it was not in my interest, and that I would not be proceeding with it. And then I told him I would be moving out at the end of October. He looked like I had told him something in a language he didn't speak. He said, "Where are you going to go?" I told him I had made arrangements. He asked what that meant. I told him I had a place to stay and that my finances were in order, and that I wanted him to know that I would still be available for the grandchildren, and that I loved him, and that none of that had changed. He sat there for a while. Then he said, "Mom, you can't just leave. What about the kids?" I said the kids would be fine. They had 2 parents. He said, "Nina is going too." I said, "I know. I—" He left without finishing the sentence. Nina did not take it calmly. There were 2 days of conversations that were not really conversations, more like arguments in which I was given information about my own character that I didn't recognize, that I was selfish, that I had been a difficult presence, that after everything they had done for me, I was leaving them in a position. I listened, and didn't defend myself much. There wasn't a point. On a Friday morning in late October, I loaded what I needed into a rented cargo van. Ingrid had come to help, and she moved boxes with the calm efficiency of someone who had been through a few things in her own life. My son watched from the front porch for a while, and then went inside. Nina didn't come out at all. My granddaughter was at school. I had said goodbye to her the night before, and told her that I was moving to a new place, and that she could come visit whenever she wanted, and that we would still make biscuits on Sundays if she wanted to. She'd asked if she could bring her stuffed rabbit to my new house sometime. I said absolutely yes. My grandson shook my hand, which was very serious and very him, and then he hugged me quickly like he was embarrassed about it. I held on a little longer than he expected. Ingrid's house had a spare room with a window that looked out over the garden. She'd put a small lamp on the dresser, and fresh flowers on the nightstand. I stood in the doorway for a moment before I went in. She came up behind me and she said, "It's yours as long as you want it." I moved my things in, and then we sat on her back porch, and she made us both tea, and we didn't talk about anything important for a long time, just the garden, the late-season tomatoes, whether the cold was coming early this year. It was the first time in a long time I had sat somewhere and not felt like I was calculating how much space I was allowed to take up. In November, I met with Loretta again. The IRA was intact. The savings account was healthy. My pension covered my share of Ingrid's household expenses, and then some, and I had redirected what was left toward a small investment account Loretta had recommended. She had printed out a 1-page summary of where I stood financially, and she slid it across the desk and said, "You're going to be fine." I looked at the page for a long time. I had worked for 31 years and been careful for 31 years and believed, somewhere in the middle of all of it, that I had made sure of this, that I would be fine, that I had earned it. And then for a period I had let myself forget that. Let myself be slowly convinced that what I had earned wasn't really mine. I folded the paper and put it in my purse. My son called in December. It was a short call. He said he wanted me to know he was sorry. He didn't specify what for exactly, but I heard something real in it, not scripted, not coached, just tired and a little ashamed. I told him I appreciated that. He asked if I would come for Christmas. I said I would think about it. I did go in the end. Christmas morning, a few hours. My granddaughter had saved a biscuit she'd made at school to show me, which had the texture of a hockey puck, and she presented it with enormous pride, and I told her it was excellent. My grandson had apparently told his class that his grandmother had her own money and lived at a friend's house, and it was actually pretty cool, which I found out from my son when he told me in the kitchen, quietly. And I could tell he was embarrassed. And something else, too. Something close to impressed, maybe, though he didn't say it out loud. Nina was polite in the careful way she had always been. We didn't hug. We sat at the same table, and we passed dishes around, and that was enough. I drove back to Ingrid's that afternoon in the thin winter light. The roads were quiet. I had a bag of leftovers on the passenger seat and a drawing my granddaughter had pressed into my hands at the door. The two of us, again with 6 fingers each, standing in front of what appeared to be a very large biscuit. I thought about Gerald on the drive home. I thought about the oak tree in the backyard of our old house in Kettering, the one he planted, and I wondered if the new owners had kept it. I hoped they had. Some things deserve to stay standing. I parked in Ingrid's driveway and sat there for a minute in the quiet. I was 68 years old, and I had my own money in my own account, and I was going to be all right. I got out of the car, and I went inside. I think about the moment I stood in that hallway with a glass of water, listening to Nina's mother ask how much I had left. And I think about how I didn't storm in, didn't say a word. Just went back to my room and sat on the edge of my bed and looked at that drawing my granddaughter had made. That was the moment everything changed. Not because I got angry, but because I got clear. I've spent a lot of time since then thinking about what went wrong and why. And I don't think it was one bad decision. I think it was a slow erosion. I let small things pass because I told myself they were small. I adjusted and I accommodated, and I told myself that was love. And it was, partly, but there's a version of love that forgets to include yourself. And I have been living in that version for a long time. What I know now is that the most important thing I did wasn't moving out. It wasn't opening that account. It was the moment I decided that what I had earned over 31 years of work was mine. Not because I was angry, but because it was simply true. I had built something, and I had every right to protect it. That's the part nobody tells you when you get older. People talk about generosity like it has no limits. Like a mother's job is to keep giving until there's nothing left and then apologize for the empty. But generosity without judgment isn't virtue. It's just disappearing slowly and calling it kindness. I called Loretta because I had enough sense left to know I needed someone steady who could look at numbers without flinching. I called Ingrid because I had maintained a friendship for 35 years with someone who was honest and good, and that turned out to be one of the most practical decisions I ever made without knowing it. The choices that save you are usually ones you made quietly, years before you needed them. My son is not a villain in this story. He is a man who got comfortable and stopped paying attention, and when the person he'd stopped paying attention to turned out to have a spine, he was surprised. That surprise, I think it was good for him. Not comfortable, but good. Nina and I will probably never be close, and I've made my peace with that. You can't manufacture warmth where there isn't any, and trying to is exhausting. What I can do is show up for those grandchildren as myself, not as a person managing everyone's feelings, not as a guest who has to earn her place, but as their grandmother, with my own home and my own money and my own life that I chose. I was 67 when I moved into my son's house. I was 68 when I moved out. In that 1 year, I learned more about who I was than I had in the decade before. I learned that being quiet is not the same as being weak, that patience and planning are not the same as passivity. that the most powerful thing I could do was not argue, it was prepare. And I learned that it is never too late to act like your own life belongs to you. Because it does.